Thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many people here praying for Pope Francis. Several people throughout the day, lots of conversations. I'm sure there's been a topic of conversation in all of your families. A lot of the same questions come up with people. And so I just wanted to offer anyone who would like to stick around, I'm happy to do a little Q&A for a little bit. There's certainly no obligation to stay. I'm sure we've all got plenty of things to get back to. But anybody who had questions about what happens next, I'm happy to stick around for a little bit and answer any of those questions. So wanted to share that. Sam Jacoby, is he here? He didn't make it in. I knew he already had some questions that he was throwing out there for us. So he's got a list. Okay. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to do my best. Yes. So we have a conclave, right? So first we have 9 days of mourning for the Pope, and so we'll have his funeral and many masses said, prayers and things like this for Pope Francis. As that's happening, the cardinals will begin traveling to Rome for the conclave. There are, we looked up the numbers. I don't remember exactly. What was it? It's 200 something. It's like. So 252 cardinals. You have to be, all cardinals under 80 are eligible to vote. And so that's 135 cardinals under 80 who will be voting. That number changes. It depends on how many people the Pope chooses to be cardinals over time. Prior to Pope Francis, there was a rule about only 120 cardinals could be at the conclave, but popes get to change most of the rules. If the popes want to change, they can change. So there are 135 voters. And so they will head to Rome for the conclave. Conclave literally means with a key, because they literally lock them in and don't let them out until they have a decision. If you go back 1,000 years, there was a conclave that lasted like a year and a half, and they finally just trapped them and said, don't come out until you're done. And so that's where the word comes from. And so they'll have this conclave now. It's changed some now because of social media and internet and things like that. But for most of the history of the church, the cardinals didn't know each other, right? And so you may be a cardinal in Italy, and the best candidate may be in Argentina, and you've never heard of him or met him or know him at all. And so part of the process of them traveling is they start to get to know each other. Now, the internet helps them know each other more. But they would arrive, and so even now, when they arrive, they will spend several days in prayer and discussion and meetings and things like that to learn about the process, to know they understand it, to get to know each other, and then they will vote. They'll begin their conclave. They do, I believe, 3 votes a day. You must have 2/3 of all the cardinals vote for you. So if there's 130, that's 85, something like that must vote for you. They'll do 3 votes a day. If after a certain number of days, I think it's 3 days, if they don't have an elected pope after 3 days, they take a couple of days break to again pray and reflect and talk and discuss. And then at some point, if they haven't reached a consensus, then it shifts to Pope Benedict made this rule that at some point, if they haven't elected someone, only the top 2 candidates remain. Okay, and so those who've had the most votes up to that point, the top 2 remain, and now you can only vote for those 2. Technically, they can vote for any baptized male that they want to. So Juan Robles here could get a vote tomorrow in the conclave, but it probably won't happen. And so then, of course, when they get the 2/3 votes, then we see the white smoke, and we all celebrate and go from there. Yes? It's similar to, we remember that our church is a church of both and, right? So we have a God who is both God and man. We have a God who is both 1 and 3. We have a world that we live in that is both good and something we're supposed to move on from, right? We have all of these things. And so we now have this time where we can both celebrate and mourn in the same way that we had both Good Friday and Easter. Right? We do all of these things because God is always all of these things and is always loving in that way. And so some people have been asked that question. One way that I've kind of thought about it is, if I ask you which is more important, the resurrection of Jesus or the death of Pope Francis, which one's more important? The resurrection of Jesus. Do you think Pope Francis would agree? Yes, he would, right? So it makes sense that we celebrate. But just the same way, we remember Good Friday happened. Jesus still has wounds in his hands, right? And so we remember that there is time of mourning even in the joy. And so we continue to celebrate Easter. The liturgies continue to be Easter. So if you come to Mass tomorrow, it will be the Tuesday of the octave of Easter. And so I think unless it's actually the funeral, then we do the Easter readings as we go along. So I think the main thing is you remember that it's both and, right? And I love that image of the risen Jesus with wounds still in his hands, because we know the resurrection is the final answer, but there is suffering along the way. And it's important to remember as well that Pope Francis, he was a sinner just like all of us, right? And it's easy to, in our world, especially now, we push people into heaven real easily and canonize them as soon as they die. I believe that Pope Francis would like us to be praying for his soul right now, because he was in charge of 1 billion Catholics and really 8 billion people around the world, that he's responsible for their souls, and that's a lot of weight to carry. And so we don't want to get so wrapped up in the resurrection and that we know Jesus brings us into eternal life that we forget to pray for his soul and the repose of his soul. Yes. We haven't talked about that beyond today. Father Tyler and I started putting this together when he went to the hospital a couple of months ago. So this was kind of on the shelf for us, ready. And so obviously today was Easter Monday. We weren't in the office, and so we haven't really gotten that far. There may be other opportunities. Those 9 days of mourning have some kind of official thing. So certainly in Rome, those things are going to be happening within the city. And so there are kind of protocols for that, but as far as our parish, we haven't gotten that far yet in our planning. We'll see. We'll let you know. No, it exists all the time. And so, as I said, priests, deacons, religious pray this all the time. And so the book form, the published form, is called a breviary. And so the breviary has all of these prayers that we use every day, Deacon Marcelino and I and Father, and we have our breviaries and we go through them every day. And many of you do as well. It's a common prayer. And so there's a 4-week rotation. And so we say the prayers, there's 4 weeks, and then you start over. But then there are special prayers at different times. Certain saints get special prayers dedicated to them. And there are also, they're called commons that can be said in various occasions. So there are lots of commons of the Blessed Virgin Mary that can be said. And so you can use one of those. But you can also use the prayers for the dead. The office for the dead is there. So we said evening prayer, Vespers. But there is also the other major prayers, so the major ones. Father can correct me if I get them wrong, because I don't have to say all 5 of them. But the office of readings is the first one in the day. Then morning prayer. Then there's daytime prayer that can be said anywhere in the middle of the day. Then evening prayer, Vespers, which we just did, and then night prayers. And so each of those prayers exists in the office for the dead, but we said evening prayer today. And yes, they can be said at any time. So if you have a loved one that says them, that would be a great thing to pray. It's a common thing to pray on All Souls Day, for example. They can be said any time if there's a need. The big news, the canonization of Carlo Acutis was supposed to happen next weekend, and it's been postponed because only the Pope can canonize. And so there's not a pope to preside over that. So that doesn't mean it's canceled. It doesn't mean he's uncanonized. It doesn't mean any of those things because, of course, canonization means we have signs that they're in heaven and he can't bring him back out of heaven. But he will be canonized, but that celebration is going to have to wait. And so I think they were prepared for 300,000 people there for that, and I'm sure people already are on their flights over and landed, and now, they'll get a different show that they get to see, which I'm sure will be memorable still for them as well. So some things have to continue. Of course, the Vatican City is a nation as well, so they have a Secretary of State and things like that. Kind of as a rule, everyone in the Vatican lost their job today, right? Because the Pope can approve anybody he wants to. The new Pope could approve anybody to all of these dicasteries and offices that he wants to. Typically, the Pope just reappoints everyone who's already in those jobs. But technically, they almost all lost their jobs today. There are a few things that continue, but it's very few. One of the main ones is called the Apostolic Penitentiary, not as in a prison, but penitentiary as in penance. And so that office remains doing its work with the two major things that they do that need to continue. One is the granting of annulments, because they want that to continue. Because again, there's no rule that says the conclave can't last months, and so they don't want to hold those up. Also, there are certain sins that have to be referred to the Vatican. There are certain sins, for example, if a priest has committed a sin that he needs to go to confession for, that there are certain sins that priests can commit that must have forgiveness from the Apostolic Penitentiary in Rome. That office continues, and it was shared with me as a reminder that God's mercy doesn't end no matter what happens, right? We can continue to function without certain Vatican offices, but we can't continue to function without the mercy of God. And so that continues. So I believe the Secretariat of State continues because it exists kind of the governmental side of things and the Apostolic Penitentiary, but most Vatican officials technically lost their jobs today. Well, so Father mentioned that a little bit. He has done some little changes. Like I said, popes can change things about their funeral and some of the rules of the conclave that they're able to change along the way. And so we've had he's Pope number 266. So different popes have done lots of things over that time. The most common place for the popes to be buried is in St. Peter's. But Pope Francis asked to be buried, for his tomb to be in St. Mary Major, which is there are 4 major basilicas in Rome. St. Peter's Basilica, which is the most famous of them, St. Paul outside the walls, St. John the Lateran, which is technically the cathedral of the Diocese of Rome, and St. Mary Major. And so he's asked to be buried in St. Mary Major. And as Father mentioned, I hadn't heard this, he mentioned that in his homily, his favorite icon of Mary is in that church, and he wanted to be buried near that icon. And so that was his wish. Another thing that he's doing differently is traditionally the popes were buried inside 3 coffins set inside of each other. And so a plain wood, I can't remember what the inside wooden one is, and then a casket of lead, which is for various protections, but also because then it can be engraved on, and then an outer casket of oak, I believe. But he's asked to be just in a single plain wooden coffin. Also, you typically see, and you can find pictures and may recall this from past, that the Pope is kind of laid in state, kind of on a litter with candles around, so a flat bed and Pope Francis asked to be immediately put into his coffin and have an open coffin, kind of like we would at a funeral here in our own church. And so there are some of those things that are similar, things that, again, as Father mentioned, that he's done differently from the beginning. Instead of wearing the traditional red shoes, he kept wearing his black shoes, various things like that, it was important for him, as he said right away, to be a poor church for the poor. And so he reduced some of the ceremonial type things that our faith does not require, but that we have little pomp and circumstance, but that our faith does not require of us. Yes, sir. Pope Francis was the 266th Pope. And now popes, it's been a little different over the years. There were some popes a long time ago that got elected multiple times. They didn't always serve until they died. There was even one pope, I think it was Pope Benedict IX, that was elected pope when he was 12 years old. And then he wound up getting elected 3 different times. So I don't know if he counted as 3 times or if he counted as just once. I'm not sure. But officially, Pope Francis is the 266th Pope. Who is the first Pope? I know you know the answer. I was asking him again. Daniel, who is the first pope? Peter was the first pope. Who is the second pope? Does anybody know who the second pope was? We got one hand up back here. Anybody else? Anybody younger than 12 know the second pope? All right, who is the second pope? Linus was the second pope. Okay, I don't know if he carried a blanket around all the time, but he was the second pope. But what's really interesting about that is that, does anyone know what year Peter died? What year did Peter die? 67. Okay, 67. Okay, so Peter died. Does anyone know when St. John, the beloved apostle, died? It's like 100 or 103, something like that. So what does that mean? How many years from 67 to 103, roughly, estimate? 40 years. Okay? That means that Pope Linus was pope when apostles were still alive. Right? So that's really neat, because we think about these 12 apostles and all the work that they did, but when Peter died, the pope wasn't just the next apostle. The pope was always the successor of Peter. Linus was the new bishop of Rome. Even though John was off in Smyrna or wherever he was, he didn't become the pope. The next bishop of Rome became the pope. And so we talk about the pope being the heir of Peter, the successor of Peter, and wearing the shoes of the fisherman, because the keys were given to Peter, not to the apostles. So that's something interesting to think about. Yes? Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, actually. There may be some research into that, or maybe that doesn't exist. I'm not sure. We do see church councils. So Acts 15 has the Council of Jerusalem. They had to decide whether the converts, non-Jewish converts to Christianity, had to follow all of the rules, circumcision and kosher meals and things like that. And so the first church council happened in Acts. So that was happening already. And so there may have been a council to elect Linus. I don't know the answer to that. It may have been that the people of the Church of Rome, acclaimed him. I'm not sure. So those things have changed over time. Now we do the 2/3 vote. But prior to 1996, there were a couple of different ways that they could be elected. One of them was by acclamation. If all of the cardinals agreed that somebody should be the pope, they could just make him the pope without ever voting. If there was a unanimous decision, they didn't have to wait for all the voting. They could just pick somebody. And until 1996, that was actually an option. So it could have been something like that. Yes, yeah. We trust that the Holy Spirit picked them, yes, however it happened. But, that could have been the case. Yeah. He would be John Paul III if he chose that name. He would be John Paul III. Or if he chose Francis, he would be Francis II. And so really any saint name can be chosen. It can be repeated. If we go backwards, so we had Pope Francis, who just died. Pope Benedict the 16th was before him, because there had been 15 Benedicts. Then we had John Paul II, John Paul I. John Paul I was only pope for 30 days before he died. Before him was Paul VI and then John the 23rd. And so John the 23rd, who had called the Second Vatican Council, Paul VI that finished it. And so John Paul I wanted to honor both of those popes who had been so influential in the council. And so he named himself John Paul I after both of them. John Paul II kind of did the same thing, recognizing both of them and his predecessor as John Paul II. And so there's various meanings that they find in those saints. I don't know if it's an official rule or if it's an unwritten rule, but I don't think anyone will ever choose Peter II. There's only been one Peter, but really any saint name they could choose. Yes. Just Peter. Peter was the only of the 12 apostles that ever became the pope. All right, we're going to get lots more questions over the next few days. If you watch the news, there's going to be lots of stuff. There's going to be lots of wrong answers and bad answers to a lot of those questions. So make sure you check out who's giving you the answers. But there's a lot to learn and a lot to see. And it is both an exciting and sad time for us as Catholics. So, all right, well, thank you all. Have a good night. Thank you for coming to pray for our Holy Father.